Imagine for a moment you are standing on the bank of a river, and the warm wind carries with it the smell of wet clay mixed with the scent of reeds. The sun is setting over the horizon, coloring the waters copper-colored, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the voices of people returning from the fields. Now imagine that you are watching this sunset, not today, not yesterday, but 5,000 years ago, in the place where what we today call civilization was first born, where, between two great rivers, the people we know as the Sumerians first wrote their thoughts on clay tablets, first created cities, first became what we are today. Greetings, my dear listeners, and I invite you to write in the comments what city you're from and what time it is where you are. Because the very idea of measuring time that we use goes back to those distant people we're going to talk about today. Close your eyes. Feel your breathing slowing down, becoming deeper, calmer. We are going on a journey, not just back in time, but to the very beginning of what makes us human in the modern world. We are going to Mesopotamia, which means the land between the rivers, to the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the hot sun turned the earth to dust if there was no water, and where the water turned the dust to emerald fields if there were skillful hands and brave hearts. Mesopotamia. The word itself sounds like a whisper of antiquity, like a song sung by the wind, flying over the ruins of cities long gone into the sand. It was a land of contrasts and contradictions, a place where nature did not spoil man with its gifts, but where this very stinginess of nature made people become inventors, dreamers, builders. Imagine a land where there are no forests, where wood is a rarity and a luxury, where stone has to be transported from far away, where the only thing the earth generously shares is clay, wet, pliable clay, mixed with the water of the great rivers. The middle of the 4th millennium BC. Try to realize this depth of time. Not hundreds of years, but thousands and thousands of years separate us from the moment when the first real cities began to appear in the southern part of this blessed and cursed land at the same time. Lower Mesopotamia, where the climate was exceptionally hot and arid, where without artificial irrigation, the land remained dead, became the cradle of what we call civilization. Here lived a people who called themselves the Blackheads, Sang-Ngiga in their language, which is unlike any other language in the world, a language whose origins are still a mystery to scholars. The Sumerians, who were they? Where did they come from in this land between the rivers? No one knows for sure. Perhaps they came down from the Zagros Mountains, where the slopes are covered with trees and shrubs. Perhaps they came from the Far East, from the Iranian highlands, or even from the valleys of Hindustan. They left us no accounts of their origins. Their culture was not interested in where something came from, but in what it was good for. Functionality, practicality, usefulness. That's what occupied the minds of the Sumerians. And yet, there are hints, quiet clues of the past. They worshipped tall shrubs where trees were rare, as if they remembered another land where forests rustled in the wind. They called themselves blackheads, perhaps because they had once lived among lighter-skinned peoples and were distinguished by the color of their hair. But the most surprising discovery of recent decades is that it may not even have been the Sumerians who founded the first cities in this land. Before them, as archaeological findings whisper, other people lived here, those we call Ubaidians, the bearers of the Ubaid culture. The cities that we used to consider Sumerian, Uruk, Nippur, Sippar, bear names that do not exist in the Sumerian language. These names are left over from those who came before, from those who may have laid the foundations of what we attribute to the Sumerians. Perhaps even cuneiform, the greatest revolution in the history of mankind, was invented not by the Sumerians, but by the Ubaidians. We do not know for sure, because the earliest writings are impossible to read. We do not know in what language those first words pressed on clay sounded. But even if the Sumerians came to cities already built, even if they borrowed writing from their predecessors, it was they who brought these inventions to perfection. It was they who created a complete system out of disparate innovations. It was thanks to them that Mesopotamia became the light that illuminated the ancient world. Let's take a walk through one of these cities, say Uruk, which about 5,000 years ago was probably the largest city on Earth. 50,000 people lived here, in this maze of streets and canals, temples and palaces. 50,000. Try to imagine that. At a time when most people on the planet lived in small tribes, roaming behind herds or living in tiny villages, here was a veritable metropolis of antiquity. Imagine you are walking through the morning streets of Uruk. The sun has just risen, but you can already feel the heat. It will increase with every hour, making the day a challenge. Beneath your feet is tamped earth and sometimes stone-paved paths. To the right and left are the walls of houses made of raw bricks, the same bricks that are made from clay mixed with straw or reeds for strength and dried in the sun. These bricks are the foundation of everything here. The houses of the common people are built of them. The walls of palaces are built of them. Even the majestic ziggurats, The very temple towers that rise to the sky like mountains made by human hands are made of them. Ziggurat. Stop for a moment and raise your eyes. In front of you stands a gigantic structure. 3 huge platforms placed one on top of the other, each smaller than the last, creating the likeness of a giant staircase to the heavens. The lower platform, massive and wide, is reinforced with reeds and lined with burnt bricks that glisten in the sun. The middle platform is slightly smaller, and finally, the top platform, where the deity's sanctuary is located, the god's home, from where he can look out over his city, his people. The 3 steps are in honor of the 3 great gods of the Sumerian pantheon: Enlil, Lord of the air; Enki, Lord of the waters and wisdom; and Anu, God of the sky. Why did they build these artificial mountains? Scientists argue about this to this day. Perhaps the Sumerians remembered their ancestral homeland in the mountains, where their ancestors worshipped gods on high peaks, and finding themselves on the flat plain of Mesopotamia, decided to recreate what they had lost. Perhaps the ziggurat was a way to elevate the city god above mere mortals, to show his greatness and inaccessibility. Or perhaps it was a ladder, a bridge between earth and heaven, a way for the gods to descend to the people and the prayers of the people to ascend to the gods. We don't know for sure, but when you stand at the foot of such a structure, you feel awe, and that feeling transcends thousands of years. You continue your walk through the city, and gradually, life awakens around you. People come out of the houses, men in simple linen or woolen skirts, women in long dresses, children running towards the canals. Yes, canals. They are everywhere in this city. The Sumerians were masters of water management, and without their irrigation systems, Uruk could not exist. Water from the Euphrates, the great breadwinner river, was channeled through a complex network of canals, dams, and reservoirs, not just for drinking and domestic use, but above all, for the fields that lay beyond the city walls. Around 4,000 years BC, before Uruk flourished, before writing had even appeared, the Sumerians had already created these amazing irrigation systems. Without them, farming in lower Mesopotamia would have been impossible. The climate was too arid, the rains too rare and unpredictable. But with water, with skillfully directed water, this land could feed thousands of people. Barley grew in fields irrigated by canals. Wheat sprouted in the hot sun. Date palms produced sweet fruit that could be eaten fresh or dried for the winter. And the Sumerians didn't just dig canals. They perfected the very tools of farming. The ox-drawn plow they developed was much more efficient than a simple hoe. They domesticated animals, not only bulls for plowing, but also sheep for wool, goats for milk and meat, donkeys for transporting goods, stable harvests, a surplus of food. That's what allowed cities to grow. That's what made it possible for not everyone to farm. Craftsmen, traders, scribes, priests, rulers. A complex and multifaceted society emerged, and where there is surplus, where there is property, where there is trade, there you need rules, laws, a system that would regulate relations between people. And the Sumerians created one of the world's first legal systems. About 2,100 years BC, King Ur-Nammu issued a code of laws, the Ur-Nammu Code, the oldest legal code known to us. These laws were carved on stone steles for everyone to see, so that no one could say they didn't know the rules. It regulated marriage, how much to pay for a bride, what happens in a divorce. Here the punishments for various offenses were established, and often not by death or mutilation, as one would expect from such an ancient time, but by monetary compensation. If a person caused injury to another, he must pay a certain amount of silver. It was revolutionary. Instead of endless blood feuds where murder begets murder, where revenge is passed on from generation to generation, there was a system where the state took on the role of judge and peacemaker. But the Ur-Nammu Code was not the first manifestation of Sumerian legal thinking. Before it were the reforms of Urwin-Imjina, an even older ruler who tried to protect the poor and the weak from the arbitrary behavior of officials. After Ur-Nammu came the laws of Lipit Ishtar, even more detailed and thorough. And then this tradition was adopted by other peoples of Mesopotamia, and the most famous result was the Code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian code of laws that many people have already heard. Back to our walk through ancient Uruk. Imagine that the sun has already risen higher. The heat is almost palpable. The air is shivering over the heated walls of the houses. You turn down a narrow alley and find yourself in front of a building from which monotonous voices are heard. It's a school, an eduba, which literally means house of tablets. Here the boys, mostly boys, were educated, daughters only occasionally, sit on the floor with clay tablets in their hands and diligently write cuneiform signs with pointed reed sticks. Eduba, the first schools in human history. Think about it. Before the Sumerians, there was no organized education, no places where parents could send their children to learn to read and write and count and think. The Sumerians created this. In Eduba, teachers called Ummia, father teacher, taught boys not only writing, but also maths, history, mythology, law. The days were long and rigorous. The teacher could punish a negligent pupil with a stick. But for those who excelled, the road to prestigious professions, to become a scribe, a priest, an official in the palace of the ruler, was opened. Look closely at what these children are doing. Their fingers, still inexperienced, hold a reed stick, a stylus, as we would call it now. They press the pointed end against the soft, wet clay, and traces remain. Little wedges that are formed into signs, and signs into words, and words into sentences, into stories, into laws, into poems. This is cuneiform, the greatest invention of the Sumerians, which changed the world so radically that we are still living in its aftermath. About 3,400 years BC. Think of that date, more than 5,000 years ago. Someone in Mesopotamia, perhaps Sumerian, perhaps Ubaidian. We have already said that we do not know exactly. For the first time, began to systematically use symbols to record not just pictures, but language. Before that, there were primitive systems, notches on bones for counting, simple drawings on stones. But this was something completely different. It was a system capable of conveying complex ideas, abstract concepts, grammatical relationships. The process took centuries. Imagine you are an archaeologist holding a clay tablet dating back to the 4th millennium BC. The images on it are very simple, almost childlike drawings. There's a symbol that looks like a suk. That's barley. This circle with dots is a sheep. These early pictograms were a way of keeping records of what was stored in the temple barns, what was received in taxes, what was given to the workers. But gradually, very gradually, the symbols simplified, became more abstract. The drawing of the bull's head turned into a few wedge-shaped dashes. And the most surprising thing is that symbols began to be used not only to denote concrete objects, but also for sounds. This transition from pictures to real writing took more than 1,000 years. From 4,000 to about 2,400 years BC, when the system finally settled down, became fully organized, capable of conveying any thought, any story. By this time, cuneiform had become not just an accounting tool, but a means of literature, poetry, philosophy. Close your eyes for the moment and imagine a scribe in his workshop. He is sitting on a low stool with a piece of fresh clay in front of him, kneaded to the right consistency, not too wet so that it won't spread, but not too dry so that the stylus can make clear marks. Nearby is a jug of water to moisten the clay if it starts to dry out. In the scribe's hand is a reed stick, cut at an angle so that the end is wedge-shaped. Hence the name of the writing, cuneiform. He works quickly, confidently. He has done this thousands of times. Wedge by wedge, line by line, the text appears on the clay. Maybe it's a contract for the sale of land. Maybe it's a letter from one merchant to another. Or maybe it's a poem, a story of ancient heroes and gods. And when the work is finished, the tablet is left to dry in the sun or fired in a kiln to make it hard, almost eternal. Thousands upon thousands of such tablets have survived to this day, a fragile legacy that has survived empires. We read them today, 5,000 years later, and hear the voices of those who have long since turned to dust. We read students' complaints against strict teachers, love letters, hymns to the gods, recipes for brewing beer, mathematical problems, astronomical observations. A whole world opens up to us through these tablets. But writing was not the only revolution made by the Sumerians. Imagine you are leaving school and walking down the street. Up ahead, there's a rumbling and banging. It's a potter's workshop. You look inside, and there, in the semi-darkness, lit only by the doorway and a small window, the potter sits in front of his circle. But this circle is not lying still. It is spinning, spinning so fast that your eyes do not have time to follow. The master's hands, wet with clay and water, touch a shapeless lump on the wheel, and before his eyes, as if by magic, the lump is transformed into an elegant jug, a bowl with thin walls, a bowl that will stand in someone's house or in a temple. Wheel, the potter's wheel. Around 3,500 years BC, the Sumerians first began using a spinning wheel to create pottery. Before that, pots were molded by hand, a slow, labor-intensive process. With the potter's wheel, everything changed. It was possible to create vessels that were faster, better shaped, thinner, and therefore lighter. But the importance of this invention was not limited to pottery, because someone, and we don't know who it was, their name is lost in the darkness of the ages. Someone looked at the spinning potter's wheel and thought, what if we use this idea for something else? What if you made the wheel bigger, attached it to an axle, and put the axle under the platform? What if you put an ox or a donkey on it? And so the wagon was born, a wheeled wagon that could carry much heavier loads and over much longer distances than could be carried on its back or dragged on the ground. The first wheels were simple, solid discs of wood, often made up of several planks fastened together. They were heavy and crude, but they worked. Wagons began to move along the roads of Mesopotamia with grain, with clay jugs of wine and oil, with copper goods, with cloth. Trade flourished. Cities that had previously been isolated from each other became networked. Ideas, goods, people began to move with unprecedented ease, and the Sumerians did not stop there. They were not only inventors and builders, but also thinkers, mathematicians, and astronomers. We leave the potter's workshop and go up to the roof of one of the houses. In the heat of Mesopotamia, roofs were often used as extra living space, a place to sleep under the stars, escaping the heat of the day. Night has descended on the city, and the sky overhead is dotted with myriad stars, a sky that in ancient times was much darker than it is now, with no city lights, no light pollution. The Milky Way stretches a bright river across the firmament. Next to you on the roof sits a priest astronomer with a clay tablet in his hands. He watches the stars, writes down their positions, watches the movement of the planets, those wandering stars that do not stand still like the rest of us, but slowly creep across the sky, changing their position from night to night. He knows when Venus, the morning and evening star, will rise. He can predict when the moon will be full, when it will be new, when there will be an eclipse, which so frightens people who consider it a sign of the anger of the gods. But astronomy for the Sumerians was not just a religion. It was a practical science. Observing the moon, they created a calendar, a lunar calendar, where a month corresponded to the cycle of the moon from new moon to new moon. This calendar allowed them to know when to sow, when to harvest, when the Euphrates would overflow, bringing fertile silt to the fields. And for all these observations, for all the calculations, they needed maths. The Sumerians developed a number system that at first glance seems strange to us who are used to the decimal system. They did not count in tens, but in 60s. The 60 decimal system is based on the number 60. Why 60? Scientists speculate differently, perhaps because 60 is divisible by many numbers: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. This made calculations with fractions much easier. Or perhaps it was a combination of the two systems. One group counted in tens, the other in dozens, and they combined their systems. Be that as it may, this system was adopted about 3,000 years BC, and traces of it have survived to this day. When you look at a clock and see that the hour is divided into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds, you see the heritage of the Sumerians. When a geometer says that a circle contains 360 degrees, 6 times 60, that too is an echo of ancient Mesopotamia. 5,000 years later, we are still using their system of more measuring time and angles. The Sumerians used maths not only for astronomy. They calculated the area of fields, rectangular, triangular, even round. They calculated the volume of granaries to know how much grain they could hold. They solved problems that today would seem familiar from school textbooks. If a farmer has a field of a certain area and collects a certain amount of grain from each unit of area, how much grain will he collect in total? Practical mathematics, the mathematics of everyday life, the mathematics that helped civilization to function. On clay tablets found by archaeologists, there are even likenesses of multiplication tables, lists of squares and cubes of numbers, problems with solutions. Pupils in Aduba copied these tablets over and over again, practicing until the knowledge was absorbed into their fingers, into their memory. And the best of them became scribes mathematicians, working for temples or palaces, doing complex calculations of taxes, resource allocation, construction planning. But perhaps the most striking thing about the Sumerians is not their inventions per se, however ingenious they may have been. What is most striking is that they understood the value of knowledge, the value of preserving and transmitting it. They created not just a written language, but an entire writing culture. Libraries, collections of tablets on various subjects, existed in temples and palaces. Archives kept records of transactions, court judgments, and correspondence. When, many centuries later, the Neo-Babylonian princess Enigaldinana, some 530 years BC, created the first known museum, collecting ancient artifacts and displaying them with tablets' descriptions. She was continuing a tradition that went back to the Sumerians, a tradition of respect for the past, for knowledge, for memory. And among all these tablets, among business records and mathematical calculations, among lists of kings and chronicles of harvests, there are special tablets, tablets on which stories are written, not just chronicles of events, but real literary works, poems, and epics that were told and retold before someone decided to entrust them to clay, to make them eternal. Imagine an evening in Uruk. The heat of the day has subsided, and people are gathering in the square or in the temple courtyard. Old men and young men, women with children, artisans after a day's work. Torches are lit, their trembling light playing on the faces of those gathered. And the storyteller comes out, maybe a priest, maybe a professional storyteller, a man whose memory holds thousands of lines of poetry. He begins to speak, and his voice sounds melodious, rhythmic, because these stories were told in verse to make them easier to remember. It tells of Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, who was 2/3 God and 1/3 man, how he was mighty and beautiful, but also proud and cruel to his people, forcing young men to work to build the city walls, giving no rest to anyone. How the gods heard the complaints of the people and created Enkidu, a wild man who lived with beasts in the steppe, knew no clothes or cities, drank water from streams with gazelles, and was as strong as a storm. The story unfolds slowly, with details that the listeners know by heart, but which they want to hear again. About how the harlot priestess from the temple of Ishtar was sent to Enkidu, how she seduced him, how after that the wild beasts stopped recognizing him as their own, how she led him to Uruk, where he met Gilgamesh. About the duel between two heroes who were equal in strength, about how their battle ended not in death, but in friendship, a deep, true friendship between two souls who had found their equal. The narrator recounts their adventures, how they traveled to the cedar forest to kill the terrible monster Humbaba, the guardian of the forest, how the goddess Ishtar fell in love with Gilgamesh, but he rejected her, knowing what fate had befallen all her former lovers, how the angry goddess unleashed the heavenly bull on Uruk, and how Gilgamesh and Enkidu slew him. But the gods decided that Enkidu should die for it. And here the narrator's voice becomes quieter, sadder, because this is the central, most poignant part of the epic. The death of Enkidu, the grief of Gilgamesh, who sits next to his friend's body for 7 days and 7 nights, unable to believe that he is no longer breathing. He sees a worm crawling out of his friend's nose, and only then realizes finally, Enkidu is dead. And Gilgamesh, the mighty hero, king of the great city, for the first time truly realizes that he too is mortal, that he too will one day die. This realization terrifies him. He can no longer sit quietly in his palace, ruling his city. He sets out on a journey, seeking immortality, looking for a way to defeat death. He goes to the edge of the world, to Utnapishtim, the only man to whom the gods have granted eternal life. And here, in the 11th tablet of the epic, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh his story, the story of the great flood. Utnapishtim was once an ordinary man who lived in the city of Shuruppak. But the god Ea, the wisest of the gods, warned him that the other gods had decided to destroy mankind with a flood. Ea told Utnapishtim to build a huge ship, take his family, artisans, the seeds of all the plants, and a couple of each of all the animals on it. Utnapishtim did so. The flood came. It rained for 6 days and 7 nights, the water rising and rising until it covered the whole earth. Even the gods were frightened by the power of the elements, which they themselves had unleashed. When the waters finally receded, Utnapishtim's ship stopped at the top of a mountain. He released a dove, but it returned without finding land. He released a swallow, and that too returned. Finally, he released a raven, and the raven did not return. So he found land. Utnapishtim sacrificed to the gods, and they repented of what they had done, and granted him and his wife immortality. The listeners know the story. They have heard it many times, not only as part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but also as a separate story. The story of the flood is deeply rooted in the memory of the peoples of Mesopotamia. And when, millennia later, European archaeologists dig up tablets with this story and read them, they will be amazed, because the story is so similar to the biblical account of Noah and his ark. Too similar to be a coincidence. A righteous man, warned by God, an order to build a ship, a flood that wiped out all mankind, a ship stopped on a mountain, birds released to search for land, the sacrifice to the gods after salvation, all the elements match. And it's not just the story of the flood. When researchers studied Sumerian mythology more deeply, they found more parallels. The story of the Garden of the Gods, where the tree of life grows. The story of the serpent who brought knowledge to the people, for which he was cursed. Tales of heroes and monsters, of wise men and sinners. What does this mean? Does it mean that the biblical authors borrowed from Sumerian sources? Many people find this troubling, making them doubtful. But perhaps the answer is not so simple. Perhaps both the Sumerians and the ancient Jews drew from the same source, from the ancient memory of mankind, from real events that took place in such a distant past that they turned into myths. Oral tradition may be older than written tradition. Just because the Sumerians recorded their stories on clay tablets in the 3rd or 2nd millennium BC does not mean that the stories themselves are not older. They could have been passed on by word of mouth for centuries, millennia, before they were written down. Indeed, there are direct references to Mesopotamia and the Sumerians in the Bible. The book of Genesis speaks of Nimrod, a mighty hunter and king, whose kingdom began in Babylon, Erech. That's Sumerian Uruk, Akkad, and Halna, in the land of Sennar. Sennaar is an early biblical name for southern Mesopotamia, which includes Sumer. Abraham, the patriarch from whom the Jews trace their descent, came out of Ur of the Chaldees, and Ur was one of the great cities of Sumer, a city of ziggurats and temples, a city that stood on the banks of the Euphrates and traded with distant lands. Perhaps the biblical narratives are not copies of Sumerian myths, but commentaries on them, reinterpretations of the same stories through the prism of monotheism. Where the Sumerians saw a multitude of gods, capricious and fickle, quarreling among themselves and using people in their games, the biblical authors saw one God, just and merciful. Where Sumerian myth said that the gods created humans to work for them and feed them with sacrifices, the Bible said that God created man in his own image and gave him dominion over the earth. Same stories, but with completely different meanings. And this should not frighten or confuse us. It should remind us that human memory is deep, that our histories are rooted in gray antiquity, that peoples and cultures are linked by thousands of invisible threads. The Sumerians were our ancestors, not necessarily in the biological sense, though perhaps in that too, but definitely in the cultural sense. They laid the foundations of what we are, but the Sumerians themselves were not unchanging, frozen in their antiquity. Their world was changing, evolving. In the 24th century BC, a powerful kingdom emerged in the northern part of Lower Mesopotamia, in an area called Akkad. The Akkadians were a Semitic people related to the later Arabs and Jews. They spoke the Akkadian language, which was very different from Sumerian. But they lived near the Sumerians, traded with them, fought, and made alliances, and intermarried. And gradually, the two peoples began to merge. Interestingly, the Akkadians also called themselves black-headed, Salmat Kakadim in their language, the same name as the Sumerians. Maybe it was the self-name of all the inhabitants of Mesopotamia, regardless of what language they spoke. Or perhaps the Akkadians adopted this name, settling among the Sumerians, as a sign that they were now one. The Akkadian kingdom was the first centralized state in the region. Before that, Sumer consisted of many city-states: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own patron gods. They traded with each other, but also fought with each other. Constant strife and conflict. Akkad united them under one king. This was a tremendous political achievement, but it also had cultural consequences. The Akkadian language began to displace Sumerian from everyday use. This happened gradually, not over decades, but over centuries. First, Akkadian became the language of administration in mixed areas, then the language of trade, then the language of the streets, even in old Sumerian cities. By the beginning of the second millennium BC, Sumerian was no longer the mother tongue of anyone. It had become a dead language, but a special dead language. It survived as a language of religion, of science, of education. When boys came to Eduba, they learnt Sumerian first, and then Akkadian. The priests conducted their services in Sumerian. Ancient texts, sacred texts, were rewritten over and over again in Sumerian. This went on for an incredibly long time, until the 1st century BC, which is almost 2,000 years after Sumerian ceased to be a living language. Imagine, as if we today were still performing religious rituals in Latin. Well, the Catholic Church did just that until fairly recently, so the analogy isn't so bad. And the Sumerians themselves, a people, not a language, they did not disappear in a moment. They mixed with the Akkadians, with the Elamites from the east, with other peoples who came to Mesopotamia. Their descendants became the Babylonians and the ancient Assyrians. By the end of the 2nd millennium, BC Lower Mesopotamia was called Babylonia, after the city of Babylon, which united the entire region under the great King Hammurabi, who ruled from 1792 to 1750 BC. The same Hammurabi whose code of laws, carved on a black diorite stele, became one of the most famous monuments of antiquity. Although, as we remember, laws existed in Mesopotamia long before him, dating back to Sumerian times. And in Upper Mesopotamia, in the north, in the valleys where the rivers flowed faster and the climate was a little milder, another civilization developed, Assyria. Assyrians were also descendants of the same peoples that settled Mesopotamia. They spoke a dialect of the Akkadian language. They worshipped many of the same gods. But they had their own destiny, their own way. In the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Assyrian power developed into the world's first true empire, a vast state stretching from the Egyptian borders to the mountains of Iran, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. The Assyrian kings were formidable warriors. Their armies, equipped with iron weapons and chariots, terrorized neighboring peoples. But they were also patrons of the arts and sciences, builders of magnificent palaces decorated with reliefs depicting hunting and battles, and creators of huge libraries. The most famous of these libraries belonged to King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BC. He collected in his capital Nineveh tens of thousands of clay tablets from all parts of his empire, scientific treatises, literary works, religious texts, historical chronicles. And among these tablets, archaeologists found the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The very Ninevian version recorded on 12 tablets, which I mentioned earlier. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who lived more than 1,000 years after the heyday of Sumer, still valued Sumerian literature, still thought it important to preserve these ancient texts. This shows the strength of the Sumerian heritage, how deeply it had penetrated the culture of all Mesopotamia. But let's go back to Sumerian times, to the days when cities were just being built, when everything was new, when every invention changed the world. We have talked about many serious things: writing and laws, math and astronomy, temples and kings. But the Sumerians were living people, and they had simple pleasures, everyday pleasures. One of these pleasures was beer. Yes, beer. The Sumerians brewed beer, and they were very proud of the art. Beer was not just a drink for fun, although it was certainly used for that as well. Beer was an important part of religious ceremonies. It was sacrificed to the gods, poured in front of statues of deities in temples. It was drunk by priests during rituals. It was paid to workers as part of their wages. A worker's ration could include a certain amount of barley and a certain amount of beer. There were even goddesses of brewing, the most famous of whom was Ninkasi, whose name literally meant the one who satiates the mouth. Imagine a Sumerian tavern. Yes, such places existed, usually run by women. Tired travelers, traders, artisans would come here after work, sit on low benches, and the hostess would pour them beer from large clay jugs. The beer was thick, cloudy, with a bread flavor, because it was made from barley bread that had been soaked in water and left to ferment. It was often drunk through long reed straws, partly because it was more convenient, and partly to avoid swallowing the sediment that settled at the bottom of the jug. People were talking, laughing, sharing news and rumors. Maybe someone would start singing an old song, and others would pick up on it. Maybe they argued about politics, whether the ruler was always fair, whether taxes were too heavy, what to think about rumors of war with a neighboring city. It was a living, breathing civilization, not frozen in a museum window, but full of life, with all its complexities and contradictions. The Sumerians had hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments, love and hate, just as we do. When we read their letters preserved on clay tablets, we find the complaints of a son writing to his mother that she visits him too infrequently. We find love poems where a girl praises the beauty and strength of her lover. We find business letters where a merchant scolds his partner for sending poor quality copper. It is all human, recognizable, close to us through the abyss of thousands of years. And yet, despite all this proximity, the mystery remains. Who were they, really, these Sumerians? Where did they come from in the valley of the two rivers? We have already touched on this question, but let us return to it again, because it is important, because it reminds us how much we do not know, how many mysteries the past still hides. The Sumerian language is unlike any other known language. Linguists call it an isolate, a language without relatives. Attempts to link it with other language families, with Turkic languages, with Caucasian languages, with Dravidian languages of India, have not led to convincing results. Its grammatical structure is unique. It is agglutinative. That is, words are formed by attaching many suffixes and prefixes to the root. And it is ergative, which means a special way of marking the subject and complement in a sentence, a way rarely found in the languages known to us. The establishment of the kinship of the Sumerian language with any other languages, if such a kinship exists at all, remains, as scholars write, a matter of the distant future. Anthropological evidence doesn't help either. Sumerian depictions of people, those statuettes and reliefs that have come down to us, show a certain style. Big eyes, straight noses, shaved heads, squat figures. But these are conventional images, following the artistic canons of the epic. We can't judge from them how the Sumerians really looked. And the remains are poorly preserved, and those that have been found are mixed with the remains of other peoples, Semites, Elamites, those Ubaidians. It is impossible to identify specific Sumerian features. Only indirect indications, hints remain. The worship of tall shrubs in a country with no real trees, perhaps a memory of a more wooded homeland. The self-name Blackheads, perhaps originating long ago when the Sumerians lived among people with lighter hair. Some scholars speculate that they came from the east, from the Zagros Mountains or the Iranian Plateau, maybe even from the Indus Valley. But these are only hypotheses, unsupported by hard evidence. And you know what? Maybe it's not that important. Maybe it's not that important where the Sumerians came from, what ethnicity they were, what language their distant ancestors spoke. What matters is what they did. What matters is the legacy they left behind. Because this heritage does not belong to any one people. It belongs to all of humanity. When you look at a clock and see that 30 minutes have passed, you are using the Sumerian number system. When you study geometry and find out that there are 360 degrees in a circle, you are touching Sumerian mathematics. When you read a book, any book, in any language, you are using an invention that goes back to Sumerian writing. When you drive a car or ride a bicycle, you are entrusting your life to a wheel first used by the Sumerians. When you live in a city with running water and sewage, with street layouts and neighborhoods, you are living in an inheritor of Sumerian cities. And not just technology. The Sumerians showed us that civilization is not just inventions, not just buildings and tools. Civilization is about cooperation. It's about working together, despite differences. It's the realization that the common good is more important than personal gain. Sumerian cities could not have existed without a complex system of cooperation. Irrigation canals required the joint efforts of many people. Ziggurats were built by the hands of thousands of workers. Trade depended on trust between partners. And civilization is about preserving knowledge, passing it on to the next generations. The Sumerians understood this deeply. They created schools so that young people would learn. They created libraries and archives so that knowledge would not be lost. They wrote down their stories, their laws, their discoveries on clay tablets that could survive centuries. And these tablets have come down to us, and we can read them, and we can learn from people who lived 5,000 years ago. In today's world, where we are faced with climate change, with dwindling resources, with the need to find sustainable ways of living, the experience of the Sumerians can inspire us. They lived in harsh conditions, in a land where nature was not pampered, where water was rare, where every harvest required incredible effort. But they did not give up. They didn't leave the land in search of an easier life. They changed the land itself, creating irrigation systems, turning the desert into a blooming garden. They teach us that human ingenuity, when directed towards the common good, can overcome almost any obstacle. Of course, the Sumerians were not perfect. They had wars, they had injustice, they had slavery, they had inequality. Their society was not a utopia, but they were pioneers. They paved the way with no examples in front of them. Everything they did for the first time. And the fact that they achieved what they achieved, despite all the difficulties, despite all the mistakes, is worthy not only of study, but also of admiration. The sun sets over ancient Uruk in our imagination. The shadows are getting longer. The air is finally beginning to cool after the heat of the day. Workers are returning from the fields, tired but satisfied. The harvest will be good this year. In the temple at the top of the ziggurat, the priests are preparing for the evening service, lighting lamps filled with oil, whose soft light will burn all night in front of the statue of the god. At the Adub school, the students are finally released and run home to their mothers, who have prepared dinner. In the taverns, the evening revival begins. Beer pours, laughter and conversation resounds. And somewhere in the scribe's house, by the light of an oil lamp, an old man is putting the last cuneiform sign on a fresh clay tablet. He has finished transcribing an ancient text, a hymn to the goddess Inanna, which he himself learnt as a child from his teacher, and the latter from his own. The scribe carefully sets aside the stylus, runs his hand over the clay, checking that all the marks are crisp and clear. Tomorrow, he will give this tablet to the temple library, where it will take its place among hundreds of other tablets. He does not know that 5,000 years from now, archaeologists will find this tablet, decipher it, and the text he transcribed will be read by people in countries he never dreamed existed. But he knows he's doing important work. He is preserving knowledge. He is passing it on to the future, and we who live in this future, unimaginably far away for the Sumerians, we have received this gift. We are heirs to their wisdom, their labors, their dreams. When we study the Sumerians, we are not just studying the dead past. We are studying the roots of our own world. We are understanding how we came to be who we are. So, thank you, dear listeners, for walking with me on this long journey into the depths of time, into the land between two rivers, into the world of the people who called themselves the Blackheads, and who unknowingly built the foundations of our civilization. I hope that this story has helped you relax, that the voice of the past whispering through the millennia has brought you peace. May your sleep be deep and peaceful. May you dream of cities with ziggurats reaching up to the sky, gardens irrigated by ancient canals, libraries full of wisdom. Good night, my friends. Until next time, when we will again travel through the pages of history to those times and places where the human spirit has worked miracles. Sleep well, and may the Sumerian stars, the very stars observed by ancient astronomers, shine in your dreams.